Welcome to my studio. Today I will primarily be discussing my video and multimedia projects. My video works draw on the visual language of painting and the history of painting, but they are more closely related to conceptual art. American artist Sol LeWitt was one of the first people to articulate a meaning for conceptual art. What he had to say is, in conceptual art, the concept or idea is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all the planning and decisions are made beforehand. My processes require a lot of pre-planning, but there's also a performative, or maybe better described as an action aspect built into my works that add a random element. Nevertheless, the underlying concepts or ideas are of fundamental importance. A couple of those ideas that run throughout my practice are the experience of nature and the nature of experience. I'll be coming back to these ideas throughout the talk as I discuss various projects. Now, these themes can be traced back to some of my early paintings, like this one here beside me, titled Planet Earth, which I painted in 1986. And the inspiration for this painting and the other paintings I was making at that time can be traced back to a series of photographs that NASA released when I was a kid. There are two images in particular. The first image is titled Earthrise, which was taken in 1968 during the Apollo 8 mission. The Apollo 8 mission orbited the moon as a reconnaissance prior to any of the moon landing missions. And this Earthrise photo was taken as they were orbiting the moon. The second image is titled Blue Marble, which was taken in 1972 during the Apollo 17 mission. Now, the Apollo 17 was the last mission to land on the moon, and the Blue Marble photo was taken on the way to the moon. And like many kids at the time, the photos taken by the astronauts had a spellbinding effect on me. The images confronted us with our cosmic situation in a new and profound way. There is a human element that makes these images so special. The astronauts had put film into a camera and physically took these photos. They were basically tourist snaps in outer space. In a strange way, the images are not so different than the kind of snapshots that I took in 1969 during a family trip to Niagara Falls. It was this kind of relatability that made the astronaut photos so powerful. I took this photo of Niagara Falls when I was 10 years old. It was the first photo I took with the first camera I ever owned. It was a hand-me-down Kodak Browning Hawkeye. That was the beginning of my lifelong relationship with photography. This eventually led to a somewhat successful career as a photojournalist. I specialized in adventure and travel photography. I may not have made it to outer space, but I did travel to some of the most remote and wild places on this planet, which gave me an interesting perspective of my own situation within contemporary culture. Even though I worked as a professional photographer, like most people, I also took snapshots throughout my life of family, friends, birthdays, holidays, that sort of thing. And of course, photography, and by extension video, became a form of artistic expression for me. Recently, I've taken on the massive job of trying to organize my photo archives. Looking back at these old photos is like seeing a trail of breadcrumbs that mark the journey of my life. Over the years, I have come to think of photography as a way to document my own existence. I want to go back to the astronaut photos for a moment. There's another aspect to these NASA images that had a lasting impact on my worldview. These were the first meaningful encounters I ever had with viral images. I call them viral images, but this is long before there was a term for such things. The blue marble is one of the most widely distributed photographic images in existence. It was everywhere, and it was truly an international phenomenon. My formative years coincided with the dawning of the age of information. It was a time when Marshall McLuhan had coined the phrase, "the medium is the message." He had also introduced the idea of the global village. I was too young to fully comprehend the gravity of what he was talking about, but somehow living through it gave me a lifelong fascination with mass media and how contemporary culture relates to the natural world. McLuhan had also brought into question the idea that a secondhand experience is somehow a lesser experience. In other words, watching TV, for example, might be considered a secondhand experience because you are passively allowing information to come to you. Whereas if you're climbing a mountain, you are engaging in the world in a different way, and it's considered a first-hand experience. So the idea is that both of these two things take a certain amount of time. And because your life is finite in terms of time, there is potential for either watching TV or climbing a mountain to be equally valid in terms of a life experience. Recently, I've been interested in the writings of ecological philosopher Timothy Morton. He takes these ideas a step further. He proposes that because humanity is a part of nature, everything that humanity creates or builds is also a part of nature. In other words, television or the internet, for example, is equally a part of nature as a forest. In my art practice, I've been trying to reconcile these ideas with my day-to-day life and how this all fits into our place in the universe. One of the ways I've done this is by examining how we measure time, which is based on astrological cycles. The planet and landscape paintings from the 80s that I showed near the beginning of the talk were about a sense of place within the context of seeing the Earth as an island in the ocean of outer space. Those works led to another series of paintings about the dance between the sun, the Earth, and the moon. I drew inspiration from Impressionist Claude Monet's series of paintings of the Rouen Cathedral. Monet was mainly interested in the effects of the changing light and shifting shadows on the building facade. I was more interested in the cause of those effects. I attempted to incorporate different times of the day into continuous landscapes. In 2008, I decided to develop a video project that takes those ideas further. It is a work titled News, Weather, and Sports, and it took me 2 years to complete. News, Weather, and Sports is currently installed in the Nickle galleries in a group exhibition titled Inside Out. The exhibition was curated by Christine Soyak and Michelle Hardy. A lot had happened between the time I did those paintings in the 80s and 2008, including the invention of the internet. One of the things circulating on the internet in the 2000s was countless time-lapse clips created by various photographers around the world. I never really liked that jittery look of time-lapses made from still photos. I wondered if I could somehow create a time-lapse that maintained real time and also incorporated a time warp that allowed time to pass quickly. I also wondered if I could make a year-long time-lapse. The concept was to witness and document the Earth orbiting the Sun from ground level. To that end, I devised a plan to go to this location at Quarry Lake in Canmore once a week for a year. I set up my tripod each week and filmed the exact same scene. I would often arrive at the location and just see a landscape with nothing going on, but would soon realize that the world is in constant flux and changes at an incredible rate. After each filming session, I would listen to the radio while I was driving back home. Inevitably, the news would come on, which was always a shock after spending so many hours in such an idyllic setting. It made me realize that nowhere on the planet was beyond the reach of human socio-political interactions. So each day, after I finished filming, I would come home and record the news. Those recordings eventually became the soundtrack for this work.
And then strangling them. Car bomb, which ripped through a crowded market on Wednesday. At least 9 91 people were killed and 200 more injured.
At least 17 people killed. 17 people killed. And then strangled. Killed. Killed.
He's been found guilty of fraud.
The interesting thing is, looking back at these recordings 10 years later, is that the news never really changes. Sure, the dates, the times, and the places all change, but the essence of the news, the natural disasters and the human conflicts, all kind of remain the same. From the beginning, the concept of this work was to commit to an entire year to the project without ever knowing if it would be possible. But the work was also a kind of performance, or perhaps better described as a ritual, that directed me to be physically present in the landscape once a week, no matter what the weather. All this to see if I could get a sense of being on a planet that's orbiting the sun. After a year of filming, I spent another year figuring out how to put the footage together in a way that matched my original concept. The final edit of this project is a series of false loops. The video appears to repeat every 3 minutes, but in fact, each loop is slightly different. It was a way to set up an association between experience, memory, and time within the work. In the end, this project was an experience of nature and is an examination of the nature of experience. John Cage stated, "Art should not be separate from life, but rather an action within life." And Joseph Boyd said, "Art can and should transform your everyday life." News, Weather, and Sports is a project that was both of these things. The next work I would like to talk about is titled Fragments of a Year, Barrier Lake. Now this project blends together 3 seemingly diverse sources. First, panoramic photography. Second, cubism. And third, quantum physics. Now back before digital cameras had panorama functions, like the thing where you hold the shutter down and move your camera across the landscape that you want to take a photo of. As a matter of fact, back before there were even digital cameras, and for that matter, before there were personal computers, the way you would create a panoramic photo was to take a series of photos across the landscape, then later take the prints and glue them together on a piece of cardboard. This was a really popular thing to do back in the 70s. In my late teens and early 20s, I used to love creating these kind of panoramic photos, especially on canoe and camping trips. I always felt that I couldn't really capture the magnitude of being out in the wilderness into a single frame. Unfortunately, none of the panoramas I made back then survived. The ones I'm showing you here, just as an example, were created for a video project I did in Berlin. In 1978, the band, The Talking Heads, used this technique to create the iconic cover for their album, More Songs About Buildings and Food. And in the early 80s, British pop artist David Hockney did a lovely series of portraits using this technique. The second source of inspiration for this project is cubism. In art history, cubism has become known as a stepping stone towards abstraction, primarily because it fits nicely into that narrative. But the original idea of cubism was to introduce the dimension of time into a two-dimensional surface. The concept was to simultaneously render different angles of the subject, like as if the viewer was moving past the subject and seeing all the sides at once. In Fragments of a Year, Barrier Lake, I have expanded on the ideas of cubism. In this project, we are seeing both time and space from multiple angles. Within the work, time exists in 4 states simultaneously. Let me try to explain. Like the process I devised for News, Weather, and Sports, I went to this location once a week for a year. Each time I arrived, I mentally broke up the landscape into a grid and then filmed each of the segments of the grid one at a time. That process took about 2 hours. So When each of those segments is assembled into the whole landscape image, like what you are seeing here now, every instant within this video represents 2 hours. In the entire project, time is also distorted in another way. A year goes by in a matter of minutes. Yet, the action within each segment, like the wind blowing in the trees, is in real time, or time at normal speed. And because the video loops, the last distortion is time repeating. The third ingredient that inspired this project is particle physics. The process was inspired by the way that quantum physics describes subatomic particles as existing in a state of probability. In this project, I try to imagine how the visible world might look if it behaved in the same way that quantum theory describes the subatomic world. To achieve that, all the filming was handheld. A 2-pound camera may not seem like much at first, but holding it at arm's length while trying to aim at an imaginary point in the landscape for 2 hours was a real mental and physical challenge. But that is how I built randomness into each clip. The segments appear to wander, but also maintain positional probability relative to the rest of the image. For my fellow video editing geeks out there, this project required 890 layers of HD video, which were rendered out into an 8K output. This might be a good time to explain why I use ornate frames to present some of my video projects. It is a way to address viewer expectations. Most video art is either projected or presented on a monitor. Both of these methods come with certain preconceived notions. Projected video reminds people of films presented in a movie theater, and video presented on a monitor reminds people of watching TV in their house. My video projects land somewhere between film and still photography. I want my viewers to come to my work with the more Zen-like mindset of someone looking at a painting. With everybody's attention being sucked into the black hole known as the American election, I thought it would be appropriate to include this work titled Relics. I've been to New York City many times over the years, but it never occurred to me to go see the Statue of Liberty. I usually just concentrate on going to museums and galleries. When I was in New York for an exhibition in 2015, I decided to go see the Statue of Liberty early one morning. That same day, in the afternoon, I was at the Met looking at little statues from empires that had long since crumbled to dust. I couldn't help but connect these relics to the Statue of Liberty that I'd seen earlier in the morning. While I was looking at those little statuettes from lost civilizations in the Metropolitan Museum, I imagined being in a museum sometime in the unknown future and seeing miniature versions of the Statue of Liberty, like those little miniature Statue of Liberties you can get at a tourist shop. I wondered how future anthropologists might describe such objects and what kind of meaning they would attribute to them. Relics is about the decline of the American Empire. In this work, the Statue of Liberty shifts between a fragmented or crumbling view, which represents the current state of America, and a view of the statue against a solid color ground, as if it were a relic presented in a museum display. During the creation of this work, I feel like I must have been subliminally influenced by this classic scene from Planet of the Apes when astronaut George Taylor, played by actor Charleston Heston, realizes that he's actually back on Earth and that humanity has destroyed itself.
You blew it up! Oh, damn you! God damn you all to hell!
This next work is titled The Illusion of the Sun Going Down. The inspiration for the work happened during a trip to Venice. Every couple of years I try to go to Venice to see the Biennale. I find it's a good way to get an overview of what's going on in international contemporary art. There is always some amazing art to be seen at the Venice Biennale, but for the most part, I usually come away with the realization of just how rich the Canadian art scene is. While in Venice, I always make time to visit some of the countless museums there. The Accademia, for example, has a fabulous collection of historic paintings. I also make sure to visit some of the more out-of-the-way, quirky museums like the Venice Museum of Natural History. The museum itself is a museum of a museum. It maintains centuries-old displays just as they were first conceived. But the inspiration for The Illusion of the Sun Going Down had nothing to do with going to museums or seeing art. It came from a typical tourist situation, or more accurately, it came about as a result of my vacation mindset. The sun sets every day, or at least we assume it does, but for most of us, most of the time, we're too busy with our contemporary lives to notice. But when we're on vacation, for some reason, we'll always stop to watch a sunset. This is exactly what I did in Venice, along with hundreds of other tourists lined along the walkways and bridges at the edge of the water. While I was watching the sunset, for some reason, a song by the Flaming Lips came to my mind. A song titled, Do You Realize?
Let them know you realize that life goes fast. It's hard to make the good things last. You realize the sun doesn't go down. It's just an illusion caused by the world spinning round. Do you realize?
In front of me, I could see the sun dropping down towards the horizon. Intellectually, I know I'm on a planet that's spinning, but having those song lyrics in my head gave me a sudden, profound shift in my perception that made me literally feel like I was on a planet spinning backwards and the horizon was moving up towards the sun. Later that night, when I was back in the apartment, checking my email and flipping through social media, I came across a video posted by NASA of a close-up of the sun. Somehow, the serendipity of seeing this image on social media and the reality of seeing the sunset earlier that evening connected with me. Later on, after the trip, when I was back home in my studio in Canmore, I was curious about the video that I'd seen of the sun. So I researched the NASA website and found the Solar Dynamic Observatory section of their website. The Solar Dynamic Observatory is a stationary satellite which takes continuous images of the sun. And all those images are time-coded. Then I downloaded the images that correspond to the time of the Venice sunset and used those images to create this animation of the sun as it's seen from outer space. So what you're looking at here is the sun from two different perspectives in the exact same moment in time. The Illusion of the Sun Going Down takes a series of loosely related experiences and examines how those experiences blend together in a unique way that makes me, me. It is about how two people standing beside each other will perceive the same situation differently based on their past life experiences. This is why, as an artist, I feel it is only ever possible to make half of an artwork. The other half of the work is completed by the life experiences that the viewer brings to the conversation. The most an artist can ever do is create an invitation to a dialogue. This circles back to the ideas I referred to earlier, the experience of nature and the nature of experience. The next work, titled 360, is about the experience of everyday life. 360 is a 12-channel video and multimedia installation. As we go about our daily routine, through familiarity, we become desensitized to our surroundings. This prevents us from being in a constant state of sensory overload, but it also has the effect of making time feel like it slips by unnoticed. When we leave our familiar surroundings, like for example when we travel, we become more hyper-aware of the world around us, which has the effect of making time feel like it expands. So much happens in a day that by evening, the morning feels like it was a week ago. When I moved to Berlin, I wanted to see if I could maintain this sensation for an entire year. To that end, I developed an idea to use street photography as a way to go out every day and shoot whatever caught my attention, no matter how banal it might be to someone who was familiar with the place. While I was in Berlin, I tried to imagine myself as an anthropologist, observing and documenting the activities, rituals, and habitat of some long-lost tribe. I soon found that the best way to move about unnoticed by the native Berliners was to look and act like a tourist, which wasn't hard because basically that's what I was. I moved about the city randomly as a way to help ward off the encroachment of familiarity. At the end of each day, I dated and categorized my fieldwork. After the year was complete, I organized all that data into time frames that correspond to the zodiac. This became the overall structure of the project. I chose to structure 360 around the zodiac as a way to connect humanity with the cosmos. But it is also a way to think about the history of how we measure time. We know that one complete orbit of the Earth around the Sun constitutes a year, but the planets move in elliptical orbits, and the Sun itself is traveling in an orbit around the galaxy at about 800,000 kilometers an hour. So, how do we know when the Earth has made one complete orbit? One way is to measure the Sun's position in respect to distant stars. This is known as a sidereal year. The sidereal year is broken up into 12 30-degree divisions. Each of these divisions works out to approximately 30 days. The imagined patterns of the distant stars within the space of each of those divisions became the symbols of the zodiac. The physical structure of 360 is also meant to evoke a variety of ways in which various civilizations have measured time. For example, sundials, megalithic sites such as Stonehenge, Mesoamerican calendars, medicine wheels, and medieval astrological clocks. There is even a nod to Stanley Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey. There are star maps on the outside panels of the 12 monoliths that make up 360. Each star map represents one of the 12 zodiac. On the inside of each monolith is the street photography footage that corresponds to the time frame of that particular zodiac. While standing inside the installation, a viewer is witnessing life on the streets of Berlin within the 12 30-degree divisions of the ecliptic. Together they make up 360 degrees. In other words, an entire year. If a viewer is looking at Cancer, for example, which is the height of summer, then 180 degrees behind them will be Sagittarius and the dead of winter. 360 celebrates the beauty of everyday life on the surface of a planet that's spinning through outer space. Throughout history and across all cultures, people have described witnessing the total eclipse of the sun as a transformative experience. In 2017, I took the opportunity to go see the total eclipse that transversed America. I studied maps and consulted Google Earth to calculate a few possible different locations along the path of totality. The idea was to have multiple options and decide where to go the day before based on the weather forecast. A total eclipse of the sun only lasts a few minutes, so one cloud in the wrong place could totally cancel the show. My partner Enza and I set out on our eclipse road trip. Along the way, we spent a week in Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone is such a surreal place. There are amazing waterfalls, abundant wildlife, crazy chromatic pools, and of course, geysers. The whole place is the cone of a supervolcano. Essentially, the Earth's crust is so thin there that the guts of the planet are spilling out. The time we spent in Yellowstone made the whole trip worthwhile, even if the eclipse didn't work out. Luckily for us, though, clear skies were forecast for the day of the eclipse. We decided to go to the most remote location on our list. We arrived there the night before and camped dead center on the path of totality, which was in the middle of nowhere in the desert of southern Wyoming. On the day of the eclipse, I mounted my cameras onto tripods and set them to automatically take photos of the eclipse so that I could just be there in the moment and fully experience the event without any distractions. Standing in the shadow of totality was simultaneously surreal, awe-inspiring, and surprisingly emotional. Once the moon fully eclipsed the sun, I could see stars in the sky. This is a drawing I did shortly after the eclipse. Back in my studio in Canmore, I developed a video installation based on the whole experience. For me, the whole experience included all the research I did for this eclipse, as well as for eclipses in general, and, of course, the actual event. Just like the eclipse itself, within my installation, the sun, the earth, and the moon were installed in perfect alignment. Like the work, The Illusion of the Sun Going Down, which I talked about earlier, the close-up video of the sun for this work was created with images from the exact same moment as the actual eclipse. In the installation, the moon is represented by videos from the Japanese lunar orbiter on one side and the moon missions on the other side. The Earth is represented by the 4 elements, with each element containing both natural and human-made components. For example, fire is represented by footage of the Mount Etna volcano and also video footage that I took of the steel mill that I worked at during the summers when I was a university student. Witnessing the alignment of the sun, the earth, and the moon was a humbling confirmation of our cosmic situation. It positions the entirety of everything that we are and everything that we have ever known on a small planet that's spinning through the vastness of outer space. Our minds are constantly making associations between our moment-to-moment experiences with our memories and other learned information. In a practical sense, this prevents us from doing things like touching a hot stove, for example. But sometimes a sound or a smell or a photograph or even a word will connect memories and ideas in interesting ways. The inspiration for this next work was triggered by the word May Day. Not surprisingly, the title of the work is May Day. This past May Day, May 1st, 2020, we are entering our second month of lockdown during the COVID-19 pandemic. I was thinking about both the irony and the appropriateness of the various associations for the word Mayday.
That's Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Speedbird 38 Papa. We have a engine shutdown.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday is a distress call for aviators in emergency situations. The distress call originated from the French word, and please excuse my pronunciation here, m'aider, which means help me. With all the anxiety and uncertainty we were facing in the early days of the pandemic, it certainly seemed like all of humanity was in distress. May Day is also recognized as International Workers' Day in support of labor rights. Suddenly, frontline workers and essential workers, such as grocery store clerks, were on the vanguard facing an unseen enemy so that the rest of the world didn't collapse into chaos. And in the Northern Hemisphere, May Day is the ancient festival of spring. May 1st is about halfway between the vernal equinox and the summer solstice. It is considered a time of rebirth. While I was alone in isolation this past May 1st, I was remembering wading through the thick crowds of people on the streets of Berlin during past May Day celebrations. In this video project, I edited footage that I shot of those crowds to resemble fence pickets or perhaps prison bars. Through the bars, as if in a hallucination, we see visions of another place and another time, but it is unclear which side of the fence we are on. From another point of view, all the various plant and animal species that we share the planet with collectively had a big sigh of relief while humanity was in lockdown. The overreaching theme of May Day is about the relationship that we, as a species, has with the planet that we live on. Within the work, the Earth is represented by the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. May Day was first shown at the White Museum in a group exhibition curated by Anne Ewan. Subsequently, I reworked the project to add a series of changing loops. For example, the water element now alternates between imagery of rivers, lakes, and oceans. Currently, May Day is being exhibited at the Angel Gallery in Toronto as part of the Art Toronto International Art Fair. The last work that I will briefly discuss here today is titled Platos Cave. It's more of a sneak peek at a project that I'm currently working on. Actually, I've been working on it for the past 5 years. It's a pretty involved project. The work was inspired by parallels between social media and Plato's allegory of the cave. In his book, The Republic, ancient Greek philosopher Plato proposed a thought experiment as a way to contemplate the ideas of truth and reality. In Plato's allegory, a group of prisoners who are imprisoned in a cave can only see the cave wall in front of them. It was all that they had ever known for their entire lives, and their entire understanding of reality is based on the flickering shadows that dance across that cave wall. The prisoners do not know how the shadows are made or of the world that's beyond the cave. Their understanding of reality is based on truth, at least their truth, which is only a partial truth. My project explores the uncanny similarities between the shadows on Plato's cave wall and the social media content that we flip through on our devices. When it is completed, this project will have 200 video displays playing content entirely sourced from social media. It will be a cross-section of the Earth as seen by a million eyes. Plato's Cave is a reaction to and a reflection upon the post-truth reality that we currently find ourselves in. Well, that's it. A big thanks to everyone at the Nickle Galleries for inviting me to speak about my work, and for their ongoing and multifaceted support of the visual arts. Hopefully this has given you a little insight into how I work and how I develop some of my video and multimedia projects. Lastly, thank you to everyone who joined me here in the realm of ones and zeros today. Hopefully one day you'll be able to see some of my work in the real world, whatever that means.